December and January are the favorite months for government. Why? Because they can pass laws when people are not paying attention. For example, in December, most people are thinking about Christmas or vacation or New Year's Eve parties. So legislation can go through and you will never know anything about it. For example, think about the Smith-Barcadere redevelopment project. The details of that were published in December. Then in January, the public became aware that the bidding process was about to close. Anyway, we know the result of that. The public fought that and the public won, and the project was stopped. This December, we saw the members of Parliament pass legislation, the Legislative Assembly Management Law, or amendment to that law, which allowed members of Parliament to receive 3 months' salary if they stood for a re-election and did not get re-elected. Now, that's not in the best interest of the people, but in the best interest of those members of Parliament who failed to get re-elected. Again, this all happened in a December period when people were not paying attention. And remember the CPR case where someone acted on behalf of the public interest or on behalf of the CPR group in order to bring a case against the government in the case of the cruise expansion facility? Well, that person had to obtain a protected cost order. Now, you obtain an order when you have a low income and you're challenging the government and you don't want to be liable for a lot of liability with a court case. So the person acting on behalf of the public in the CPR case was able to obtain a protective cost order to avoid that liability. During that period, the government amended the judicature law in order to say that in order to apply for a protective cost order now, the court has a discretion to determine if you are an appropriate person to bring a claim on behalf of the public. So, as you can see, there's a trend in general where the government is amending laws or making new legislation to make it harder for the public or the ordinary man to bring a claim against the government. Another way that the government has made things more difficult for the ordinary person is by passing an amendment to the Freedom of Information Law. Again, this was done in a December or January period when people were not paying attention. So before this amendment happened to the Freedom of Information Law, you as a member of the public could request copies of cabinet minutes, which would disclose contracts or dealings with cabinet and would encourage transparency with members of the public. Before this amendment, as a member of the public, if there was a public interest to get those records, you could get them by simply making a Freedom of Information request on the basis of the public interest test. Now, the amendment to the Freedom of Information Law removed that ability to use the public interest test. If you listen carefully to the following interview with the Supervisor of Elections, you'll hear of new changes coming. Before you listen, you should note that under the current elections law, all expenses that a candidate incurs after nomination day, which is the end of March, are all counted to the limit of expenses allowed for a candidate under the elections law. However, when you listen closely to this interview with the Supervisor of Elections, you learn that new guidelines are coming.
Towards the $40,000 spend or not?
So 67 subsection 2 speaks to when expenses are incurred. So that's accrual accounting terminology and not cash. So it really doesn't matter when you pay for your goods and services. If they're received and consumed during the period between nominations and elections, they ought to be reported on as part of your expense bits. So not cash accounting, accrual accounting, and regardless of when you actually cut a check and you may actually pay for it before or after the election. I think there's a bit there that says all your debts need to be settled before you make your claim. But the terminology within 67.2 is that the expenses are incurred. So this time around on nominations day, our plan is to give persons the reporting form and the guidance notes to filling out that form, which will go into great detail as to what the accounting standard that must be met in relation to the submissions of that.
Now, if you listen carefully, the supervisor of elections uses the word incurred. Now, the word incurred in relation to expenses is not defined under elections law. But now, Cabinet or the election supervisor is about to issue guidelines as to what incurred means. He also says these guidelines are going to be very detailed, including a requirement to conduct an audit on all of the expenses of each candidate. Now, this has never been done before. There's no problem with a candidate doing this, but questions remain. Who will pay the cost of an audit? As you know, an audit by an accounting firm, for example, could be anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000. So if a candidate has to pay this extra $20,000 or $30,000, that will take him or her over the expense limit under the elections law. Now think about that.